Mr.ShroomCaster. You know, I used to be the guy people would look at and say, he's got it all figured out. And honestly, at that time, I really believed I had cracked the code to life. It all started about 10 years ago when I was just another office worker at a small company. Same old routine, fixed salary barely covering expenses. Then one day, I stumbled upon an article about how the stock market works. Something clicked, and I decided to give it a shot. I saved up a few $100s, bought my first shares. It was a gamble, but it paid off. Step by step, I learned how this massive system worked. At first, it was tough, but eventually, I got good at it. So good that one day I realized there was no point in staying at my office job. I quit, took all my savings, and dove headfirst into investing full-time. It was terrifying, but that risk paid off big time. By the time I was in my early 30s, I owned my own house in the suburbs of New York. It wasn't a mansion, but it was a cozy 2-story home with 3 bedrooms, a spacious kitchen, and a living room centered around a fireplace. Out back, there was a small yard with a grill and a few trees. That house was my sanctuary, a place to work, relax, and dream big. I drove one nice car, not a supercar or anything flashy, but something reliable and satisfying. I believed in being practical. Money works best when invested, not wasted on things that lose value. Investments were my primary income, but I was always looking for other opportunities. One day, I thought, why not create something of my own? That's how I came up with the idea of a coffee cart. The first cart opened within a year. It was small but inviting. Walls adorned with local art, eco-friendly furniture, unique drinks. People loved it. Within 2 years, I had 3 carts. They weren't huge, but they brought in steady revenue. I personally hired the staff, checked every detail, the menu, the atmosphere, the service quality. It wasn't just a business, it was a passion project. My day started the same way. At 6 in the morning, I'd get up, brew myself a cup of our signature coffee, and sit at my laptop. The first thing I opened was stock market news. Charts, trends, analysis, that was my zone. By 8, I was either at one of the coffee carts or heading to a meeting with partners. Lunch hours were filled with business discussions over modest meals. I'd head back to my small office upstairs at one of the carts, where I'd spend a few hours on reports and strategy. Evenings often involved friends. I had a circle of like-minded individuals, entrepreneurs, financial experts, people who shared my drive. We'd play table tennis, share ideas, and support each other's ambitions. Traveling was another joy of mine. Nothing extravagant, just a few days at a Florida beach or a quick trip to Chicago. It was my way to recharge and come back with fresh energy for new projects. I was happy. Everything felt under control. I believed it was just the beginning of an even greater success. I had big plans, expanding the coffee business, exploring new investment opportunities, maybe even venturing into real estate. Life felt stable, perfectly aligned. Most importantly, I believed I deserved it. Everything I had was a result of my hard work and determination. I was confident I could handle any challenge. But here's the thing. When you're on top, you never imagine how quickly it can all fall apart. 2008. Even now, when I think about that year, my chest tightens. You know, there are moments when the world feels solid, like an unbreakable wall. Then suddenly, you see cracks, the foundation crumbles, and before you know it, everything collapses right on top of you. At first, things were fine. The year began with more successful deals. My investments were thriving, the business was steady, and I was even planning to expand with 2 more coffee carts in nearby neighborhoods. The market was growing, the money was coming in, and I truly believed this was just the start of something even bigger. Then I heard the news. The housing market bubble is about to burst, they said. Financial pundits on TV started discussing risks and how this might impact the economy. But like many others, I thought, not my problem. That's for banks and real estate developers to worry about, not someone like me. So, I kept investing. The stock market seemed stable, and I always followed the mantra. If something dips, buy more because it'll rebound eventually. And at first, this strategy worked. Stocks fell a bit, but then climbed again. I relaxed, thinking it was just a temporary correction. Then September came. The market didn't just dip, it plummeted. Everything spiraled downward in a chain reaction. Stocks that seemed rock solid just days earlier lost their value in a heartbeat. One morning, I woke up, checked my portfolio as usual, and felt my heart drop. Nearly all my investments were practically worthless. It wasn't a correction, it was a disaster. At first, I tried to fight back. I called my brokers, looking for advice, desperate for solutions. But all the answers were the same. It's a crisis. Nobody knows how long this will last. Then my business started feeling the squeeze. Foot traffic at the coffee carts slowed to a crawl. People were saving every penny they could, even on small comforts like coffee. Revenues plummeted, but expenses stayed the same. And then there were the banks. Those friendly institutions that had practically thrown loans at me before were now breathing down my neck. They wanted their money back. I tried negotiating, explaining that the downturn was temporary, but they didn't care. To them, I was just another account on their books. One by one, I had to shut down my coffee carts. It was heartbreaking. Each cart represented a part of me, something I'd built from the ground up. I'll never forget closing the first one. It was where we'd served our first customers, where I'd poured my heart into creating something meaningful. Standing there, turning off the lights for the last time, felt like losing a piece of myself. Then came my house. I couldn't keep up with the mortgage payments, and the bank repossessed it. I remember standing in the empty living room, staring at the walls, thinking, how did it come to this? That house wasn't just a place to live. It was a symbol of everything I'd achieved. And now it was gone. I moved into a small rental apartment. No fireplace, no yard, just a cramped room with a bed and a worn-out table. My car was the next to go. I couldn't afford the payments, so I sold it. The hardest part wasn't even the financial loss. It was the loneliness. People I'd called friends, partners, allies, stopped answering my calls. Those who once admired my confidence and decisions now wanted nothing to do with me. I was alone, with a mountain of debt, paralyzed by fear and disappointment. Every morning, I woke up with a weight on my chest. I didn't know how I'd make it through the day, but I had to. I had no choice. This was my mess, the result of my own decisions. And that realization was the heaviest burden of all. 2008 was the hardest year of my life. It was the year I learned just how fragile success can be when you build it on overconfidence and fail to leave yourself a safety net. It was a harsh, painful lesson, but one I'd never forget. Moving into that tiny rental apartment was a wake-up call. Everything I owned fit into a few boxes. Some clothes, a laptop, and a stack of bills I couldn't pay. Gone was the spacious home, the car, the business. Now, all I had was this cramped, dimly lit room with peeling paint and a rickety bed. The first few weeks were the hardest. I'd wake up early, but there was no drive, no plans, no direction. I'd sit at the small table, scrolling through job listings on my laptop. My resume looked solid, but the economy was in shambles, and no one was hiring. The market crash had left everyone scared, and jobs were scarce. I tried to leverage my skills. I reached out to old contacts, offering investment advice, even for small portfolios. But the same fear that had paralyzed me gripped everyone else too. Nobody wanted to risk anything, even with safe strategies. Eventually, I had to take a job, any job. The first one I landed was on a warehouse floor, sorting and packing boxes. The pay was minimum wage, and the work was grueling. My hands ached from lifting and packing, and my back throbbed after every shift. The people at the warehouse didn't know much about me, but they could tell I didn't fit in. Some joked that I must have gotten lost on the way to Wall Street. Others just ignored me. I worked nights at the warehouse and spent my days at home, trying to figure out my next move. This wasn't where I wanted to be, but it was a start. Then I picked up a second job as a night security guard at a grocery store. It wasn't exciting, but it paid a little more. The long, quiet hours gave me time to think. Sitting in a tiny room, staring at surveillance monitors, I replayed the past year in my mind. I went over every decision I'd made, every risk I'd taken. I realized how reckless I'd been, always betting big, never leaving myself a cushion. That overconfidence had been my downfall. But those nights alone gave me clarity. I started to piece together a plan, not to make millions again, but to find stability. After months of working 2 jobs, I saved a small amount of money. It wasn't much, but it was a start. I knew I had to do something with it, something small but sustainable. One morning, after a long shift, I stopped by a modest coffee shop. It wasn't fancy, but it was warm and welcoming. Customers came in, ordered their drinks, chatted with the barista. I watched as the shop owner greeted regulars by name, joking and smiling as he poured their coffee. That's when it hit me. Coffee wasn't just a drink. It was a ritual, a comfort. Even in the middle of a crisis, people still wanted their coffee. I decided to start small. Not another full-fledged cafe, but something simpler, a coffee cart. A single, mobile cart that I could manage myself. The next few weeks were a blur. During the day, I worked on my plan, researching suppliers, looking for used equipment, and scouting locations. At night, I packed boxes or watched surveillance feeds. Finally, I scraped together enough money to buy an old cart and fix it up. It wasn't much to look at, but it was mine. I parked it near a busy intersection by some office buildings, hoping the morning rush would bring in customers. The first day was nerve-wracking. I stood there, waiting for someone, anyone, to stop by. And when they did, when that first customer handed me a few dollars for a cup of coffee, I felt something I hadn't felt in months: hope. Business was slow at first, but I kept at it. I made sure every cup was perfect, greeted every customer with a smile, and remembered their names and orders. It wasn't just about selling coffee. It was about creating a connection. At night, I was still working the warehouse and security jobs, barely sleeping, but I didn't care. That cart became my lifeline. It was a way to prove to myself that I could still build something, even from nothing. As the weeks went on, more people stopped by. Some became regulars, and others spread the word. Slowly but surely, I began to see progress. Starting over was humbling. I had to let go of my ego, my pride, and accept that this was where I needed to be. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was moving forward. The coffee cart became my lifeline, but running it was no walk in the park. Every day was a battle to stay afloat. I woke up at 5 every morning, prepped everything, and parked the cart at the busy corner near the office buildings. For the first few weeks, I felt invisible. People rushed by without even glancing at me. I made it my mission to win them over. Every cup of coffee had to be perfect. I greeted everyone with a genuine smile and remembered the names of those who came back. Slowly, people started to notice. The morning rush brought in a handful of customers, then a few more. But progress was slow, and the competition was fierce. There were bigger coffee shops nearby with more resources, better branding, and lower prices. I couldn't compete with that. I was barely covering costs, let alone turning a profit. The stress was overwhelming. After closing the cart each day, I'd head straight to my night job at the warehouse or the grocery store. By the time I got back to my tiny apartment, I was too exhausted to think, but my mind wouldn't let me rest. I'd lie in bed calculating expenses, wondering if I could keep going. There were days I wanted to quit. One night, sitting at my table with a pile of unpaid bills, I thought, maybe this isn't for me. Maybe I'm just fooling myself. But every morning, I'd get up, drag myself to that cart, and try again. The turning point came from an unexpected source. One of my regulars, a guy named John, stopped by one morning and said, "You know, your coffee's great, but you should add something to the menu. People like me would grab breakfast here if you had pastries or sandwiches." The idea made sense, but I didn't have the resources to expand. John must have seen my hesitation because he said, "Listen, I know a guy who runs a bakery. I can introduce you. He'll give you a good deal." That simple suggestion changed everything. John introduced me to the bakery owner, and within a week, I started selling fresh croissants, muffins, and cookies alongside my coffee. Suddenly, I wasn't just a coffee cart. I was a one-stop morning shop. The difference was immediate. Customers began lining up for coffee and a quick breakfast. Office workers brought their colleagues. People who'd never stopped by before became regulars. With the extra revenue, I was able to hire my first employee, a college student who worked part-time. She helped during the busy hours, giving me time to focus on improving the business. It was a small step, but it felt monumental. Encouraged by the success, I expanded. I found a used coffee cart for sale, refurbished it, and set it up near another office building. Managing 2 carts was twice the work, but it was worth it. Growth didn't come without challenges. There were days when equipment broke down, or suppliers didn't deliver on time. Once, a storm ruined an entire day's sales, soaking my cart and scaring off customers. But every setback taught me something. I learned to be more resourceful, to plan better, to always have a backup. Little by little, I began to see stability. The income from the carts was enough to cover my expenses, pay off some debts, and even save a little. But the real reward wasn't the money. It was the connections I made. My customers weren't just faceless transactions. They were people with stories, routines, and lives I became part of. One day, a regular customer told me, "Your coffee cart is the best part of my morning. I used to hate coming to work, but now I look forward to stopping here." Hearing that made all the struggle worthwhile. I realized that my success wasn't just about rebuilding my finances. It was about creating something meaningful, something that brought a little joy to people's lives. By the end of that year, I had 3 carts in operation. Each one had its own loyal following. I still worked long hours, but for the first time in years, I felt like I was on solid ground. The journey wasn't over, but I'd come a long way. From losing everything to building something new, I'd learned that success isn't about never falling. It's about getting back up every time you do. I was fighting for my place under the sun, and I was finally starting to feel its warmth again. A few years passed since I opened my first coffee cart, and life finally started to make sense again. What began as a desperate attempt to survive had grown into a small but thriving business. I now own 5 coffee carts scattered across the city and even managed to open 2 small cafes and lease spaces. These weren't flashy establishments. They were cozy, welcoming spots where people could enjoy a great cup of coffee and a sense of connection. I'd learned that success didn't need to be loud or grand. It just needed to feel real. The customers who visited weren't just clients. They were part of my journey. I greeted many of them by name, remembered their orders, and listened to their stories. My business wasn't just about selling coffee. It was about being a part of someone's day, their routine, their comfort. One morning, a young woman came up to me at one of the cafes. She worked in a nearby office and had been a regular since the cart days. She smiled and said, "You know, I don't think you realize how much this place means to people. Your coffee, your kindness, it's what keeps me going some days." Her words stuck with me. Back when I was at my lowest, I never imagined I'd build something that mattered to others. It gave me a sense of pride I hadn't felt before, one that wasn't tied to numbers or profits, but to purpose. But it wasn't just about the coffee anymore. I started reflecting on what I'd learned over the years. Losing everything had taught me humility, resilience, and the importance of building something meaningful. I wanted to share those lessons. I began hosting small workshops for local entrepreneurs, people who were trying to start businesses of their own but didn't know where to begin. I'd tell them my story, not to brag, but to show them that even when you hit rock bottom, you can rise again. I emphasized the importance of starting small, managing risks, and staying connected to your customers. I wanted them to understand that success isn't about chasing big dreams blindly. It's about taking deliberate steps and building something sustainable. The workshops became popular, and soon I was mentoring a few young entrepreneurs personally. I'd meet them in my cafes, listen to their ideas, and offer guidance. It felt good to give back, to help others avoid the mistakes I'd made. Financially, I was stable. I wasn't rich, but I didn't need to be. The carts and cafes provided enough for a comfortable life, and I'd finally paid off most of my debts. I didn't drive a fancy car or live in a big house, but I didn't miss any of it. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to slow down. I spent more time with family, caught up with old friends, and even started reading again, something I hadn't done since my corporate days. Life felt balanced, grounded, and meaningful. One evening, as I sat outside one of my cafes, John, the regular who'd once suggested I add pastries, stopped by for a coffee. He smiled and said, "You know, I knew you'd make it. You've built something special here, something that matters to people. That's real success." I thought about his words long after he left. He was right. What I'd built wasn't about prestige or wealth. It was about purpose. It was about creating something that made people's lives a little brighter. Sometimes, I look back on the crash of 2008 and wonder what life would have been like if it hadn't happened. Would I still be chasing numbers, blind to what truly mattered? Probably. Losing everything forced me to see the world differently, to rebuild not just my career, but my values. In the end, losing it all wasn't the worst thing that happened to me. It was the best. It gave me a second chance to create a life that mattered. Today, I'm not just a businessman. I'm a part of my community, a mentor, and someone who's learned the true meaning of resilience. And that's worth more than all the money I ever made before.